Hey, good evening. It is time for part 9 of Fingerprints of the Gods. We're going to do two chapters tonight, chapters 26 and 27. We'll finish out part 4 of the book. Um, so, yeah, we'll just jump on into it. So, chapter 26 is titled A Species Born in the Earth's Long Winter. In all that we call history, everything we clearly remember about ourselves as a species, humanity has not once come close to total. What? Okay, let me start that again because that didn't even make any sense. In all that we call history, everything we clearly remember about ourselves as a species, humanity has not once come close to total annihilation. In various regions at various times, there have been terrible natural disasters, but there has not been a single occasion in the past 5,000 years when mankind as a whole can be said to have faced extinction. Has this always been so, or is it possible if we go back far enough that we might discover an epoch when our ancestors were nearly wiped out? It is just such an epoch that seems to be the focus of the great myths of cataclysm. Scholars normally attribute these myths to the fantasies of ancient poets, but what if the scholars are wrong? What if some terrible series of natural catastrophes did reduce our prehistoric ancestors to a handful of individuals scattered here and there across the face of the earth, far apart and out of touch with one another? We are looking for an epoch that will fit the myths as snugly as the slipper on Cinderella's foot. In this search, however, there is obviously no point in investigating any period prior to the emergence on the planet of recognizably modern human beings. We're not interested here in Homo habilis or Homo erectus or even Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. We're interested only in Homo sapiens sapiens, our own species, and we haven't been around very long. Students of early man disagree to some extent over how long we've been around. Some researchers, as we shall see, claim that partial human remains in excess of 100,000 years old may be fully modern. Others argue for a reduced antiquity in the range of 35 to 40,000 years, and yet others propose a compromise of 50,000 years, but no one knows for sure. Quote, the origin of fully modern humans, denoted by the subspecies name Homo sapiens sapiens, remains one of the great puzzles of paleoanthropology, admits one authority. Uh, End quote, admits one authority. About 3.5 million years of more or less relevant evolution are indicated in the fossil record. For all practical purposes, that record starts with a small bipedal hominid nicknamed Lucy, Australopithecines, uh, whose remains were discovered in 1974 in the Ethiopian section of East Africa's Great Rift Valley. With a brain capacity of 400 cc's, that's cubic centimeters, less than a third of the modern average, Lucy definitely wasn't human, but she wasn't an ape either, and she had some remarkably human-like features, notably her upright gait and the shape of her pelvis and back teeth. For these and other reasons, her species, classified as Australopithecus afarensis, has been accepted by the majority of paleoanthropologists as our earliest direct ancestor. I think that's gone back quite a bit farther beyond her at this point. About 2 million years ago, representatives of Homo habilis, the founder members of the Homo line to which we ourselves belong, began to leave their fossilized skulls and skeletons behind. As time went by, this species showed clear signs of evolution towards an ever more gracile and refined form, and towards a larger and more versatile brain. Homo erectus, who overlapped with and then succeeded Homo habilis, appeared about 1.6 million years ago with a brain capacity in the region of 900 cc's, as against 700 cc's in the case of habilis. The million or so years after that, down to about 400,000 years ago, saw no significant evolutionary changes, or none attested to by surviving fossils. Then Homo erectus pass through through the gates of extinction into hominid heaven, and slowly, very, very slowly, what the paleoanthropologists call, quote unquote, the sapient grade began to appear. Quote, exactly when the transition to a more sapient form began is difficult to establish. Some believe the transition, which involved an increase in brain size and a decrease in the robustness of the skull bones, began as early as 400,000 years ago. Unfortunately, there are simply not enough fossils from this important period to be sure about what was happening, end quote. And remember, he was writing this back in the 90s. A lot more has come to light since then, including the Denisovans. I'm not sure they had been discovered quite yet when he wrote this. What was definitely not happening 400,000 years ago was the emergence of anything identifiable as our own storytelling, myth making subspecies Homo sapiens sapiens. The consensus is that, quote, sapient humans must have evolved from Homo erectus, end quote. And it is true that a number of archaic sapient, quote unquote, populations did come into existence between 400,000 and 100,000 years ago. Unfortunately, the relationship of these transitional species to ourselves is far from clear. As noted, the first contenders for membership of the exclusive club of Homo sapiens sapiens have been dated by some researchers to the later part of this period, but these remains are all partial and their identification is by no means universally accepted. The oldest part of a skull cap is a putative modern human specimen from about 113,000 BC, and around this date too Homo sapiens neanderthalensis first appears, a quite distinct subspecies which most of us know as Neanderthal man. Tall, heavily muscled, with prominent brow ridges and a protruding face, Neanderthal man had a bigger average brain size than modern humans, 1400 cc's as against our 1360 cc's. The possession of such a big brain was no doubt an asset to these, quote, intelligent, spiritually sensitive, resourceful creatures, end quote. And the fossil record suggests that they were the dominant species on the planet from about 100,000 years ago until 40,000 years ago. At some point during this lengthy and poorly understood period, Homo sapiens sapiens established itself, leaving behind fossil remains from about 40,000 years ago that are undisputably those of modern humans, and supplanting the Neanderthals completely by about 35,000 years ago. In summary, human beings like ourselves, whom we could pass in the street without blinking an eye if they were shaved and dressed in modern clothes, are creatures of the last 115,000 years at the very most, and more probably of only the last 50,000 years. It follows that if the myths of cataclysm we have reviewed do reflect an epoch of geological upheaval experienced by humanity, these upheavals took place within the last 115,000 years and more probably within the last 50,000 years. Cinderella's slipper. It is a curious coincidence of geology and paleoanthropology that the onset and progress of the last ice age and the emergence and proliferation of modern man more or less shadow each other. Curious, too, is the fact that so little is known about either. In North America, the last ice age is called the Wisconsin Glaciation, named for rock deposits studied in the state of Wisconsin, and its early phase had been dated by geologists to 115,000 years ago. There were various advances and retreats of the ice cap after that, with the fastest rate of accumulation taking place between uh, 60,000 years ago and 17,000 years ago, a process culminating in the Tazewell advance, which saw the glaciation reach its maximum extent around 15,000 BC. By 13,000 BC, however, millions of square miles of ice had melted for reasons that have never properly been explained, and by 8,000 BC, the Wisconsin had withdrawn completely. And here I think is where we're getting into the we're getting close to the end of the Younger Dryas, and the theory that it could have been actually a comet impact in the Arctic that melted all those glaciers and caused a lot of destruction like the deluge. The Ice Age was a global phenomenon affecting both the northern and the southern hemispheres. Similar climatic and geological conditions therefore prevailed in many other parts of the world as well, notably in Eastern Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and South America. There was massive glaciation in Europe, where the ice reached outward from Scandinavia and Scotland to cover most of Great Britain, Denmark, Poland, Russia, large parts of Germany, all of Switzerland, and big chunks of Austria, Italy, and France. Known technically as the Würm glaciation, this European ice age started about 70,000 years ago, a little later than its American counterpart, but attained its maximum extent at the same time, 17,000 years ago, and then experienced the same rapid withdrawal and shared the same terminal date. The crucial stages of Ice Age chronology thus appear to be 1. Around 60,000 years ago, when the Würm, the Wisconsin, and the glaciation and other glaciations were well underway. 2. Around 17,000 years ago, when the ice sheets had reached their maximum extent in both the Old World and the New. 3. The 7,000 years of deglaciation that followed. The emergence of Homo sapiens sapiens thus coincided with a lengthy period of geological and climatic turbulence, a period marked above all else by ferocious freezing and flooding. The many millennia during which the ice was remorselessly expanding must have been terrifying and awful for our ancestors, but those final 7,000 years of deglaciation, particularly the episodes of very rapid and extensive melting, must have been worse. Let us not jump to conclusions about the state of social or religious or scientific or intellectual development of the human beings who lived through the sustained collapse of the tumultuous epoch. The popular stereotype may be wrong in assuming that they were all primitive cave dwellers. In reality, little is known about them, and almost the only thing that can be said is that they were men and women exactly like ourselves, physiologically and psychologically. I think psychologically would be is a bit of a stretch. We have no idea what they would be like psychologically. It is possible that they came close to total extinction on several occasions during the upheavals they experienced. It is also possible that the great myths of cataclysm, to which scholars attribute no historical value, may contain accurate records and eyewitness accounts of real events. As we see in the next chapter, if we are looking for an epoch that fits those myths as snugly as the slipper on Cinderella's foot, it would seem that the last ice age is it. And that is the end of chapter 26. So we'll jump on into 27, which is quite a bit longer. Twice as long, in fact. Um, Chapter 27, the face of the earth was darkened, and a black rain began to fall. Terrible forces were unleashed on all living creatures during the last ice age. We may deduce how these afflicted humanity from the firm evidence of their consequences for other large species. Often this evidence looks puzzling, as Charles Darwin observed after visiting South America. Quote, "No one, I think, can have marveled more at the extinction of species than I have done. When I found in La Plata, Argentina, the tooth of a horse embedded with the remains of mastodon, Megatherium, Toxodon, and other extinct monsters, which all coexisted at a very late geological period, I was filled with astonishment for seeing that the horse, since its introduction by the Spaniards in South America, has run wild over the whole country and has increased in numbers at an unparalleled rate. I asked myself what could have so recently exterminated the former horse under conditions of life apparently so favorable." End quote. The answer, of course, was the Ice Age. That was what exterminated the former horses of the Americas and a number of other previously successful mammals. Nor were extinctions limited to the New World. On the contrary, in different parts of the earth, for different reasons and at different times, the long epoch of glaciation witnessed several quite distinct episodes of extinction. In all areas, the vast majority of the many destroyed species were lost in the final 7,000 years from about 15,000 BC down to 8,000 BC. At this stage of our investigation, it is not necessary to establish the specific nature of the climatic, seismic, and geological events linked to the various advances and retreats of the ice ages, which killed off the animals. We might reasonably guess that tidal waves, earthquakes, gigantic windstorms, and the sudden onset and remission of glacial conditions played their parts. But more important, whatever the actual agencies involved, is the stark empirical reality that mass extinctions of animals did take place as a result of the turmoil of the last ice age. This turmoil, as Darwin concluded in his journal, must have shaken, quote, the entire framework of the globe, end quote. In the New World, for example, more than 70 genera of large mammals became extinct between 15,000 BC and 8,000 BC, including all North American members of 7 families and one complete order, though the Proboscidae. These staggering losses, involving the violent obliteration of more than 40 million animals, were not spread out evenly over the whole period. On the contrary, the vast majority of the extinctions occurred in just 2,000 years, between 11,000 BC and 9,000 BC. To put this in perspective, during the previous 300,000 years, only about 20 genera had disappeared. The same pattern of late and massive extinctions was repeated across Europe and Asia. Even far off Australia was not exempt, losing perhaps 19 genera of large vertebrates, not all of them mammals, in a relatively short period of time. Alaska and Siberia, the sudden freeze. The northern regions of Alaska and Siberia appear to have been the worst hit by the murderous upheavals between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago. In a great swath of death around the edge of the Arctic Circle, the remains of uncountable numbers of large animals have been found, including many carcasses with the flesh still intact, and astonishing quantities of perfectly preserved mammoth tusks. Indeed, in both regions, mammoth carcasses have been thawed to feed to sled dogs, and mammoth steaks have featured on restaurant menus in Fairbanks. One authority has commented, quote, hundreds of thousands of individuals must have been frozen immediately after death and remained frozen, otherwise the meat and ivory would have spoiled. Some powerful general force was certainly at work to bring this catastrophe about. Dr. Dale Guthrie of the Institute of Arctic Biology has made an interesting point about the sheer variety of animals that flourished in Alaska before the 11th millennium BC. Quote, when learning of this exotic mixture of saber-toothed cats, camels, horses, rhinos, asses, deer with gigantic antlers, lions, ferrets, and saiga, one cannot help wondering about the world in which they lived. This great diversity of species, so different from that encountered today, raises the most obvious question: is it not likely that the rest of the environment was also different? End quote. The Alaskan muck in which the remains are embedded is like a fine, dark gray sand, frozen solid within this mass in the in the words of Professor Hibben of the University of New Mexico, quote, lie the twisted parts of animals and trees intermingled with lenses of ice and layers of peat and mosses. Bison, horses, wolves, bears, lions, whole herds of animals were apparently killed together, overcome by some common power. Such piles of bodies of animals or men simply do not occur by any ordinary natural means. End quote. At various levels, stone artifacts have been found, quote, frozen in situ at great depths and in association with Ice Age fauna, which confirms that men were contemporary with extinct animals in Alaska, end quote. Throughout the Alaskan mucks, also, there is, quote, evidence of atmospheric disturbances of unparalleled violence. Mammoth and bison alike were torn and twisted as though by a cosmic hand in godly rage. In one place we can find the foreleg and shoulder of a mammoth, with portions of the flesh and toenails and hair still clinging to the blackened bones. Close by is the neck and skull of a bison, with the vertebrae clinging together with tendons and ligaments, and the chitinous covering of the horns intact. There is no mark of knife or cutting instrument, or there would be if human hunters, for example, had been involved. The animals were simply torn apart and scattered over the landscape like things of straw and string, even though some of them weighed several tons. Mixed with piles of bones are trees, also twisted and torn and piled in tangled groups, and the whole is covered with a fine sifting muck, then frozen solid. End quote. Much of the same picture emerges in Siberia, where catastrophic climatic changes and geological upheavals occurred at around the same time. Here, the frozen mammoth graveyards, mined for their ivory since the Roman era, were still yielding an estimated 20,000 pairs of tusks every decade at the beginning of the 20th century. Once again, some mysterious factor appears to have been at work in bringing about these mass extinctions. With their woolly coats and thick skins, mammoths are generally considered adapted to cold weather, and we are not surprised to come across their remains in Siberia. Harder to explain is the fact that human beings perished alongside them, as well as many other animals that in no sense can be described as cold adapted species. Quote, the northern Siberian plains supported vast numbers of rhinoceroses, antelope, horses, bison, and other herbivorous creatures, while a variety of carnivores, including the saber-toothed cat, preyed upon them. Like the mammoths, these other animals ranged to the extreme north of Siberia to the shores of the Arctic Ocean, and yet further north to the Lyakov and New Siberian Islands, only a very short distance from the North Pole. End quote. Researchers have confirmed that the 34 animal species living in Siberia prior to the catastrophes of the 11th millennium BC included Ossip's mammoth, giant deer, cave hyena, and cave lions. No less than 28 were adapted only to temperate conditions. In this context, one of the most puzzling aspects of the extinctions, which runs quite contrary to what today's geographical and climatic conditions lead us to expect, is that the farther north one goes, the more the mammoth and other remains increase in number. Indeed, some of the new Siberian islands, well within the Arctic Circle, were described by the explorers who first discovered them as being made up almost entirely of mammoth bones and tusks. The only logical conclusion, as the 19th century French zoologist Georges Cuvier put it, is that, quote, this eternal frost did not previously exist in those parts in which the animals were frozen, but they could not have survived in such a temperature. The same instant that these creatures were bereft of life, the country which they inhabited became frozen. End quote. There is a great deal of other evidence which suggests that a sudden freeze took place in Siberia during the 11th millennium BC. In his survey of the New Siberian Islands, the Arctic explorer Baron Edward von Toll found the remains of, quote, of a saber-toothed tiger. I'm sorry, let me try that again. Found the remains, quote, of a saber-toothed tiger and a fruit tree that had been 90 feet tall when it was standing. The tree was well preserved in the permafrost, with its roots and seeds. Green leaves and ripe fruit still clung to its branches. At the present time, the only representative of tree vegetation on the islands is a willow that grows 1 inch high. End quote. I wonder if any of those. Oh, ow. That may have been a mistake. I wonder if any of those seeds are viable. I mean, they've found seeds that are many thousands of years old that are viable. So that would be cool to grow whatever that fruit tree is. Anyway, equally indicative of the cataclysmic change that took place at the onset of the Great Cold in Siberia is the food the extinct animals were eating when they perished. Quote, the mammoths died suddenly in intense cold and in great numbers. Death came so quickly that the swallowed vegetation is yet undigested. Grasses, bluebells, buttercups, tender sedges, and wild beans have been found, yet identifiable and undeteriorated in their mouths and stomachs. End quote. Needless to say, such flora does not grow anywhere in Siberia today. Its presence there in the 11th millennium BC compels us to accept that the region had a pleasant and productive climate, one that was temperate or even warm. Why the end of the last ice age why the end of the last ice age in other parts of the world should have been the beginning of fatal winter in this former paradise is a question we shall postpone until part 8. What is certain, however, is that at some point between 12,000 and 13,000 years ago, a destroying frost descended with horrifying speed upon Siberia and has never relaxed its grip. In an eerie echo of the Avestic traditions, a land which had previously enjoyed 7 months of summer was converted almost overnight into a land of ice and snow with 10 months of harsh and frozen winter. A thousand Krakatoas all at once. Many of the myths of cataclysm speak of times of terrible cold, of darkened skies, of black, burning, bituminous rain. For centuries, it must have been like that all the way across the arc of death, incorporating immense tracts of Siberia, the Yukon, and Alaska. Here, quote, interspersed in the muck depths, and sometimes through the very piles of bones and tusks themselves, are layers of volcanic ash. There is no doubt that coincidental with the extinctions, there were volcanic eruptions of tremendous proportions. End quote. There is a remarkable amount of evidence of excessive volcanism during the decline of the Wisconsin ice cap. Far to the south of the frozen Alaskan mucks, thousands of prehistoric animals and plants were mired all at once in the famous La Brea tar pits of Los Angeles. Among the creatures unearthed were bison, horses, camels, sloths, mammoths, mastodons, and at least 700 saber-toothed tigers. A disarticulated human skeleton was also found, completely enveloped in bitumen, mingled with the bones of an extinct species of vulture. In general, the La Brea remains, quote, broken, mashed, contorted, and mixed in the most heterogeneous mass, end quote. Um, speak eloquently of a sudden and dreadful volcanic cataclysm. Similar kinds of typical late Ice Age birds and mammals have been unearthed from asphalt at two other locations in California, Carpinteria and McKittrick. In the San Pedro Valley, mastodon skeletons were discovered still standing upright, engulfed in great heaps of volcanic ash and sand. Fossils from the glacial Lake Floriston in Colorado and from Oregon's John Day Basin were also excavated from tombs of volcanic ash. Although the tremendous eruptions that created such mass graves may have been at their most intense during the last days of the Wisconsin, they appear to have been recurrent throughout much of the Ice Age, not only in North America but in Central and South America, in the North Atlantic, in continental Asia, and in Japan. It is difficult to imagine what this widespread volcanism might have meant for people living in those strange and terrible times, but those who recall the cauliflower-shaped clouds of dust, smoke, and ash ejected into the upper atmosphere by the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980 will appreciate that a large number of such explosions occurring sequentially over a sustained period at different points around the globe would not only have had devastating local effects, but would have caused a severe deterioration in the world's climate. I remember the eruption. I remember ash falling around our house. Not a lot, but some. Mount St. Helens spat out an estimated 1 cubic kilometer of rock and was small scale by comparison with the typical volcanism of the Ice Age. A more representative impression would be the Indonesian volcano Krakatoa, which erupted in 1883 with such violence that more than 36,000 people were killed, and the explosion was heard 3,000 miles away. From the epicenter in the Sunda Strait, tsunamis 100 feet high roared across the Java Sea and the Indian Ocean, carrying steamships miles inland and causing flooding as far away as East Africa and the western coasts of the Americas. 18 cubic kilometers of rock and vast quantities of ash and dust were pumped into the upper atmosphere. Skies all over the world were noticeably darker for more than 2 years, and sunsets notably redder. Average global temperatures fell measurably during this period because volcanic dust particles reflect the sun's rays back into space. During the episodes of intense volcanism which characterized the Ice Age, we must envisage not one but many Krakatoas. The combined effect would at first have been a great intensification of glacial conditions, as the light of the sun was cut by the boiling dust clouds, and as already low temperatures plummeted even further, volcanoes also inject enormous volumes of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide is a so-called greenhouse gas, so it is reasonable to suppose, as the dust began to settle during periods of relative calm, that a degree of global warming would have occurred. Not true. A number of authorities attribute the repeated advances and retreats of the great ice sheets to precisely this seesaw interaction between volcanism and climate. Global flooding, geologists agree that by 8000 BC, the Great Wisconsin and Würm ice caps had retreated. The Ice Age was over. However, the 7,000 years prior to that date had witnessed climatic and geological turbulence on a scale that was almost unimaginable. Lurching from cataclysm to disaster and from misfortune to calamity, the few scattered tribes of surviving humans must have led lives of constant terror and confusion. There would have been periods of quiescence when they might have hoped that the worst was over. While the melting of the giant glaciers continued, however, these episodes of tranquility would have been punctuated again and again by violent floods. Moreover, sections of the Earth's crust, hitherto pressed down into the asthenosphere by billions of tons of ice, would have been liberated by the thaw and begun to rise again, sometimes rapidly, causing devastating earthquakes and filling the air with terrible noise. Sometimes were much worse than others. The bulk of the animal extinctions took place between 11,000 BC and 9,000 BC, when there were violent and unexplained fluctuations of climate. In the words of geologist John Imbrie, quote, a climatic revolution took place around 11,000 years ago, end quote. There were also greatly increased rates of sedimentation and an abrupt temperature increase of 6 to 10 degrees centigrade in the surface waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Another turbulent episode, again accompanied by mass extinctions, took place between 15,000 BC and 13,000 BC. We saw in the previous chapter that the Tazewell advance brought the ice sheets to their maximum extent around 17,000 years ago, and that a dramatic and prolonged thaw then ensued, completely deglaciating millions of square miles of North America and Europe in less than 2,000 years. There were some anomalies. All of western Alaska, the Yukon Territory in Canada, and most of Siberia, including the New Siberian Islands, now among the coldest parts of the world, remained unglaciated until the Ice Age was near its end. They acquired their present climate only about 12,000 years ago, apparently very abruptly, when the mammoths and other large mammals were frozen in their tracks. Elsewhere, the picture was different. Most of Europe was buried under ice 2 miles thick. So too was most of North America, where the ice cap had spread from centers near Hudson Bay to enshroud all of eastern Canada, New England, and much of the Midwest, down to the 37th parallel, well to the south of Cincinnati in the Mississippi Valley, and more than halfway to the equator. At its peak 17,000 years ago, it is calculated that the total ice volume covering the northern hemisphere was in the region of 6 million cubic miles, and of course, there were extensive glaciations in the southern hemisphere too, as we have noted. The surplus water flow from which these numerous ice caps were formed had been provided by the world's seas and oceans, which were then about 400 feet lower than they are today. It was at this moment that the pendulum of climate swung violently in the opposite direction. The great meltdown began so suddenly and over such vast areas that it has been described as a sort of miracle, quote unquote. Geologists refer to it as the boiling phase of warm climate in Europe and as the Brady interstadial in North America. In both regions, quote, an ice cap that may have taken 40,000 years to develop disappeared for the most part in 2000. It must be obvious that this could not have been the result of gradually acting climatic factors usually called upon to explain ice ages. The rapidity of the deglaciation suggests that some extraordinary factor was affecting the climate. The dates suggest that this factor first made itself felt about 16,500 years ago, that that it had destroyed most, perhaps three-quarters, of the glaciers by 2,000 years later, and that the vast bulk of these dramatic developments took place in a millennium or less. End quote. Inevitably, the first consequence was a precipitous rise in sea levels, perhaps as much as 350 feet. Islands and land bridges disappeared, and vast sections of low-lying continental coastline were submerged. From time to time, great tidal waves rose up to engulf higher land as well. They ebbed away, but in the process left unmistakable traces of their presence. In the United States, quote, Ice Age marine features are present along the Gulf Coast east of the Mississippi River, in some places at altitudes that may exceed 200 feet. End quote. In bogs covering glacial deposits in Michigan, skeletons of two whales were discovered. In Georgia, marine deposits occur at altitudes of 160 feet, and in Northern California at altitudes of at least 240 feet. In Texas, well to the south of the farthest extent of the Wisconsin glaciation, the remains of Ice Age land mammals are found in marine deposits. Another marine deposit containing walrus, seals, and at least 5 genera of whales overlies the seaboard of the northeastern states and the Arctic coast of Canada. In many areas along the Pacific coast of North America, Ice Age marine deposits extend, quote, more than 200 miles inland, end quote. The bones of a whale have been found north of Lake Ontario, about 440 feet above sea level. A skeleton of another whale in Vermont, more than 500 feet above sea level, and another in the Montreal, Quebec area, about 600 feet above sea level. Flood myths from all over the world characteristically and recurrently describe scenes when humans and animals flee the rising tides and take refuge on mountaintops. The fossil record confirms that this did indeed happen during the melting of the ice sheets, and that the mountains were not always high enough to save the refugees from disaster. For example, fissures in the rocks on the tops of isolated hills in central France are filled with what is known as osseous breccia, consisting of the splintered bones of mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and other animals. The 1,430 feet peak of Mount Genet in Burgundy, quote, is capped by a breccia remain containing remains of mammoth, reindeer, horse, and other animals, end quote. Much further south, so too is the Rock of Gibraltar, where a quote a human molar and some flints worked by Paleolithic man were discovered among the animal bones, end quote. Hippo remains, together with mammoth, rhinoceros, horse, bear, bison, wolf, and lion, have been found in England in the neighborhood of Plymouth on the Channel. The hills around Palermo in Sicily disclosed an quote extraordinary quantity of bones of hippopotami in complete hecatombs, end quote. On the basis of this and other evidence, Joseph Prestwich, formerly professor of geology at Oxford University, concluded that Central Europe, England, and the Mediterranean islands of Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily were all completely submerged on several occasions during the rapid melting of the ice sheets. Quote, the animals naturally retreated as the waters advanced deeper into the hills until they found themselves embayed. They thronged together in vast multitudes, crushing into the more until accessible caves until overtaken by the waters and destroyed. Rocky debris and large blocks from the sides of the hills were hurled down by the currents of water, crushing and smashing the bones. Certain communities of early man must have suffered in this general catastrophe. End quote. It is probable that similar flood disasters occurred in China at much the same time. In caves near Beijing, bones of mammoths and buffaloes have been found in association with human skeletal remains. A number of authorities attribute the violent intermingling of mammoth carcasses with splintered and broken trees in Siberia, quote, to a great tidal wave that uprooted trees and buried the tangled carnage in a flood of mud. In the polar region, this froze solid and has preserved the evidence in permafrost to the present. End quote. All over South America, too, Ice Age fossils have been unearthed. Excuse me. Quote, in which incongruous animal types, carnivores and herbivores, are mixed promiscuously with human bones. No less significant is the association over truly widespread areas of fossilized land and sea creatures mingling in no order and yet entombed in the same geological horizon. End quote. North America was also badly affected by flooding. As the Great Wisconsin ice sheets melted, they created huge but temporary lakes, which filled up with incredible speed, drowning everything in their paths, then drained away in a few hundred years. Lake Agassiz, for example, the largest glacial lake in the New World, once occupied an area of 110,000 square miles, covering large parts of what is now Manitoba, Ontario, and Saskatchewan in Canada, and North Dakota and Minnesota in the United States. Remarkably, it endured far less than a millennium, indicating a catastrophically sudden episode of melting and flooding followed by a period of quiescence. A token of good faith. It was long believed that human beings did not reach the New World until around 11,000 years ago, but recent findings have steadily pushed the horizon back. Stone implements dated to 25,000 BC have been identified by Canadian researchers in the Old Crow Basin in the Yukon Territory of Alaska. In South America, as far south as Peru and Tierra del Fuego, human remains and artifacts have been found which have been reliably dated to 12,000 BC, with another group between 19,000 BC and 23,000 BC. With this and other evidence taken into account, quote, a very reasonable conclusion on the peopling of the Americas is that it began at least 35,000 years ago, but may well have included waves of immigrants at later dates too, end quote. In fact, I learned in archaeology classes about some possible campsites that have been found along the coast of Peru, I believe, that were almost 50,000 years old. But they were controversial, and that was back in roughly 2000. Those newly arriving Ice Age Americans trekking in from Siberia across the Bering Land Bridge would have faced the most appalling conditions between 17,000 and 10,000 years ago. It was then that the Wisconsin glaciers all at once went into their ferocious meltdown, forcing a 350-foot rise in global sea levels amid scenes of unprecedented climatic and geological turmoil. For 7,000 years of human experience, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and immense floods, interspersed with eerie periods of peace, must have dominated the day-to-day lives of the New World peoples. Perhaps this is why so many of their myths speak with such conviction of fire and floods and times of darkness and of the creation and destruction of suns. Moreover, as we've seen, the myths of the New World are not in this respect isolated from those of the Old. All around the globe, a remarkable uniformity reveals itself over issues such as, quote, the Great Flood, end quote, and the Great Cold, quote unquote, and the time of the Great Upheaval, quote unquote. It is not just that the same experiences are being recounted again and again. That on its own would be quite understandable, since the Ice Age and its after effects were global phenomena. More curious by far is the way in which the same symbolic motifs keep recurring. The one good man and his family, the warning given by a god, the seeds of all living things saved, the survival ship, the enclosure against the cold, the trunk of a tree in which the progenitors of future humanity hide themselves, the birds and other creatures released after the flood to find land, and so on. Isn't it also odd that so many of the myths turn out to contain descriptions of figures like Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha, said to have come in the time of darkness after the flood to teach architecture, astronomy, science, and the rule of law to the scattered and devastated tribes of survivors? Who were these civilizing heroes? Were they figments of the primitive imagination, or gods, or men? If they were men, could they have tampered with the myths in some way, turning them into vehicles for transporting knowledge through time? Such notions seem fanciful, but as we shall see in Part 5, astronomical data of a disturbingly accurate and scientific nature turns up repeatedly in certain myths as time-worn and as universal in their distribution as those of the Great Flood. Where did their scientific content come from? And that is the end of that chapter and of part 4 of the book. So for the next reading, Tuesday, barring catastrophe, we'll start part 5, titled The Mystery of the Myths to the Processional Code. And we get to start right off with a picture of the celestial sphere, which is interesting. So we'll take off from there next time. Let me see who is around. Nah. I don't see anybody I want to raid. So I will just leave it there. I will see you in the next one. Have a good night.
Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but not lights like I had, but more sophisticated into love